Smear faces, Lord, they hate to hear your message. Though I'm geared with your protection, your armor that I've been blessed with, no stressing. When I'm trying to teach them all your lessons, they looking at me crazy like I got a weird perspective. Smear faces, Lord, they hate to hear your message. Though I'm geared with your protection, your armor that I've been blessed with, no stressing. When I'm trying to teach them all your lessons, they looking at me crazy like I got a weird perspective.
Yo, what's going on, YouTube? Welcome back to another episode of the Weird Perspective podcast. Today I have a special guest. Unfortunately, my co-host, Mr. Raymond Woods, he can't join me today, but I have a special guest who is going to shed some light. We're going to talk about some spooky things, some scary things, some horror things, and we're going to have fun. But until then and before then, make sure you guys hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and the whole point of this podcast is that we want to encourage you, challenge you, motivate you, and inspire you to go deeper in your walk with Jesus. If you don't know who Jesus is, man, there's a free little Bible app called the Bible app, literally. Download it, start reading it, and just get familiar with the Bible and who Jesus is and what he came to do and how much he loves you. That's what we want to do on this channel. So it's not to condemn anybody, but we want to have conversations and tough conversations that we can't necessarily have in a church setting. And so moving on from there, the man that I have in front of me is a guy that I am getting to know. His name is Ethan, and he is, are you a pastor officially?
I'm a pastoral resident, so
pastoral resident.
Yeah, in training.
Welcome to the channel, future pastor, Ethan. Man, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Nah, man, the pleasure's all mine. The honor is mine, man. I've kind of been like stalking you from the shadows a little bit, just in passing, as we've come across each other in different spaces and events, and so I got to know you a little bit, but. Share with the people who might be watching this a little bit about who you are, where you're from.
Yeah. I was born in Southern California, but moved to Rockford, Illinois. I'm definitely more Midwestern than I am Californian, the more you get to know me. But I moved to Chicago for college, and I've been in the city for, 7 years or so. A couple years ago, we moved out to Oak Park, which is just outside of Chicago. But, been here at a church on the west side. That's been a wonderful experience for me. And just recently with this pastoral residency, I'm kind of in the process of being sent out by the church back to suburban context to figure out how to pastor well out there and love people well out there. And that's a space that needs to be led well, especially when it comes to churches. I think sometimes it's suburbs is where church goes well, and they got everything sorted out, and they're just kind of selfish with it, right?
Yeah.
And so you got to figure that out.
They got the
but
big churches,
I think it goes a lot deeper than that.
The big churches, the big budgets,
right? Yeah,
but they're not being discipled well.
Yeah, I think so. And so a lot of my history, growing up in that sort of context. I came to the city, been here for a long time, but just throughout a process of hearing God's voice and talking to our pastors, my wife and I are being kind of pushed out to go back towards that area.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Where'd you go to school?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad at Moody Bible Institute, and then just finished up a master's program at Northern Seminary, which is out in the suburbs of Chicago as well.
Nice. Nice. Well, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
And
thank you.
Man, I hope it all goes well. We'll talk off camera about what suburb you're going to, because I probably know I know a little bit about the suburbs.
Right.
I'm a city boy, but I did live in the suburbs for my early adulthood, and I kind of have friends and family all over. So I'm kind of like a Chicago mutt. I grew up in Logan Square, but my dad lived in Austin on the west side, and then my mom's side, they lived on the south side in Inglewood. Yeah. My mom got remarried. We moved to the suburbs. And I had a lot of pastors and friends of the family that lived in different parts of the city and suburbs. So, yeah, man, I got my my tracks all over the place,
Right.
man. So
Yeah.
we'll talk. We'll talk.
A lot of
man.
very different spaces. Yeah. They're all very different.
Yeah, but today we're here to talk about Halloween, and Halloween is coming up here in a few days. And what's your experience with Halloween? Did you grow up celebrating Halloween?
Yeah. Yeah. I grew up celebrating Halloween, yes, but with certain certain boundaries, I'd say. Maybe, certain restrictions, certain like we don't do that
Okay.
part of Halloween. But yeah, I grew up in areas where, we trick or treat, areas where we dress up, school would have a day where it's like come to school in your costume.
Yeah.
We do that. Always a lot of fun. I have fond memories of Halloween because of that. It was a very like community based thing. It's one of like the only times for me where in the neighborhood all of the kids would be out at the same time.
Yeah.
And it's like I know people that I'm going to school with,
Mhm.
right, who are in this neighborhood in elementary school, right? But I don't see you outside regularly. Like I see my neighbors, but beyond that, I don't see everybody. And so, yeah, I have fond memories of it. But both my parents were like culturally Christian, I would say, and over time have developed some more like personal commitment to walking with Christ as opposed to just doing what Christians do, quote unquote, And so I think a lot of the boundaries growing up around Halloween were based on not so much what my family had deep convictions about, but more so this is just what Christians do, right? Like, sure, go do that, but like you can't dress up as anything scary, right? So stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so definitely celebrated Halloween growing up with boundaries and had a great time with it. Yeah, I have very fond memories.
Yeah. I have a similar childhood. So my mom was like super like sold out for Jesus.
Yeah.
I was in church like 4 times a week.
Amazing.
So she was very much like
Yeah.
in my early childhood, like no scary movies or like no over demonic movies. I couldn't listen to like secular music up until I think like 13, 14 is when she started letting me listen to secular music.
Yep.
But yeah, Halloween was definitely like we're not dressing up.
Yeah.
I could go trick or treating, but it wasn't a thing for me. Like I just took that time to be outside, so I would just be running around.
Yeah. Yep.
And then if I had like a plastic bag or something, I'd be like, "Let me get some candy in here." But yeah, it wasn't a thing in my household. We didn't celebrate it, and so my mom she let my sister do certain things, and my sister grew up a certain way that was different than me, and so she had certain freedoms than I didn't have.
Yeah.
So if she allowed my sister to do something, like my sister would go out trick or treating, and she's like, "You gotta take your brother with you." And so that's how it was for me. It wasn't the whole thing of putting on a costume or anything like that.
Right.
So yeah. And just from your childhood up to now, how have your perspective changed on Halloween, if it has changed?
Yeah. How has it changed? I don't know if my perspective has changed. I think it's become maybe more thought out in a certain sense. Definitely where how I engage with Halloween now as an adult is different than if you're a kid, right? Like I don't go trick-or-treating anymore.
Right.
But we live in a space where kids will come trick-or-treating and we'll pass out candy to them, right? Like we're not going to shut our lights off and be like, go away. We don't celebrate Halloween here kind of house. And it's a ton of fun. Like
All I can
handing
think
out
of
candy
is
to
that
kids.
scene from
It's
the
so
Adam
fun.
Sandler Big Daddy.
Yeah.
And he goes and knock on the door, the dude's not ready. He's like, "Hey buddy, do the right thing. We want some candy."
We want some candy.
I'm sorry,
That's so funny.
things triggers you to think about movies and stuff, but I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Right. No, but I've definitely thought I've had to spend some time thinking about what what it means to celebrate Halloween as a Christian. Is it something that we should do? It's if you grow up in the church, right? I think, at least my experience is, you're around a lot of people who speak very differently about Halloween. Like there's some people in the church who don't really care that deeply about it. Some people who are really convinced that this is something nobody should do, or like my parents were, like with boundaries, right? And And so I think growing up in the church, I was forced to reconcile with like, oh, it seems like this is something people think about or care about. What do I think about? What do I care about? What do I believe is happening here? Why am I doing this? And so through that process, I don't know that my position has changed at all.
Okay.
From how I was, like when I say I was raised celebrating Halloween with boundaries, maybe that's almost like a good way to say like how I talk about it now. It's like, oh yeah, celebrate Halloween, but with boundaries, right?
So do you think
but it's just more fleshed out.
Do you think the day itself is like sinful or demonic?
Yeah. I don't think that. I know a good number of folks who do.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm just not convinced that that's actually true about like what Halloween is. Like there's a number of things that I've been able to a while ago, I forget what newspaper it was in, but there were like some articles put out by like Christian historians about Halloween, and I remember reading them and thinking, oh yeah, this makes sense. Like this, like the normal way that we talk about it, where it's like this pagan holiday and it's still a pagan holiday. The history is more complicated than that.
Yeah.
Especially in the U.S. I mean, like the U.S. was not founded by people who were pagans, right? Like they had a different framework than like the people who we say created Halloween, right? Like those old school European pagan dudes or whatever. It's like those aren't the people that came to the U.S. And so why are we celebrating in the U.S. now? And so there's like a history to that, right? That I think is a little more complicated. But it comes up in church often. I mean, I'm sure you experienced that. I'm so sorry.
No, you're good.
Like there's people who don't celebrate Christmas or Easter because of the same things, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh, it's connected to a pagan history, right? And so I don't want to adopt a like tradition that's not rooted in scripture or not rooted in Jesus. And so, you know, Halloween's one thing, but it's like people approach all the holidays. Like it kind of like there's a bigger group that does it for Halloween and like a much smaller group that does it for Christmas and an even smaller group for Easter. But it's like there's people that do it for all of that. Like people in the church, Christians who are like convicted. This is not a holy day, right? This is a bad day.
Would you say that we need to have that approach with all holidays? Because all holidays have some type of pagan roots behind it. Even the days of the week are named after pagan gods, right?
Right, yeah.
It's not like, hey, we're gonna do away with Monday because it's named after this pagan god. How would you say Christians should process through that? Like, let's just start with like Halloween. So there's some do's and some don'ts, because it's not just black and white, right? There's a gray area. So what's some do's and some don'ts that you yourself would say? Right. I wouldn't do that. That's sinful. That's kind of.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think that one, what I might do or I wouldn't do is not something that I think is going to be true for everybody in every place. Yeah. Right. I think there's certain areas where I might do things that should never be done in this other maybe you go to a different country, or maybe you're in like rural America and everybody thinks a certain way, and it's like, yeah, you just shouldn't do trick-or-treating, right? Because it communicates something about who you are. Yeah. But that's just not true of like where I am, right? Like if I'm living in suburban America, for the most part, trick-or-treating doesn't communicate to the people I'm around, my neighbors, or even like my family, hey, I'm like celebrating these pagan ideas, right? Like I'm just not convinced that that's what's happening there. Some people in some areas, that might be what it communicates, right? So the things that I would say no to and I would say yes to are going to be personal for me and would be different for other people. But I do think there has to be some like thought given to why we do what we do. And in my experience, it tends to go towards the restriction side as opposed to the freedom side, right? Like when we think about what we're doing as Christians of the church, it tends to go to the point of, well, there's some pagan roots here, or there's some like, oh, death is here, or horror is here, and those are inherently bad things. And we just assume that without thinking about like what it means that we're talking about death or we're talking about horror. And so we just say, oh, that's bad. And so we write it off. And it's like, you don't take it as far as you could with the thought process, you know? Yeah. Like we got to think deeper than sometimes we do, right? Yeah. About like what everything means.
I had to do that the first time with, you know, I got 5 kids. And so when they're like, we want to wear costumes, I'm like, okay, well, what kind of costume you want to wear?
Right.
And so if you come at me with the Michael Myers mask and a knife, I'm probably going to be like, no. But if you say, hey, I want to wear a Michael Jordan jersey or dress up as a Chicago Bulls player or even like Superman or something like that, then I'll be like, all right, that's cool.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, those things represent, you know, fun, justice, whatever, right? So I'm thinking through like, what does that represent? When somebody looks at me and sees me wearing this, what are they gonna think about? And then, you know, the stuff that we wear and the things that we do, it promotes something. And so if I'm wearing a Scream mask and I got a knife in my hand, it's just promoting murder. I'm instantly gonna start thinking about murder and people being killed.
Yeah.
And so those were the things that I gave to my kids to think through. Like,
right. Yeah.
You know, what you wear and you know what you're doing on this day, it matters. And so
right. Which I think is true of anything. I mean, in the same way that like with Christmas, parents are like, well, do we talk about Santa Claus or not? Right. And it's like, well, what does Santa Claus communicate? Right. Is it going to communicate this idea that like Christmas is fundamentally a time where it's like you get a lot of stuff and it just feeds consumerism, or you're like looking around at other people who are getting stuff and you're not, and it's just reminding you of these like the brokenness of the world? Or is it communicated differently and it's like a reminder of like gift that points back to what Christians celebrate Christmas for, right? And so it's like, how do you do these things? Yeah, right, because you can do them different ways.
I struggled with Christmas when all the holiday stuff came up because I told my kids like right away, like, Santa Claus ain't real. Like, you know, I'm not giving him credit. I bought them toys.
Right. Yeah. I just want you to know. Right.
I just want you to know.
I put the work in for that. Yeah.
It's not just like, hey, we could write a list and you just go get this toy. Like that costs money.
Right.
And so I would tell them, but don't go to your school and just be broadcasting like Santa Claus is fake and just start talking to your peers about it, because to them Santa Claus may still be real, you know, and they might hadn't had that conversation with their family. So I'm telling you, but you don't need to go tell anybody else. You let them and their family deal with that. And so, that was going on for a while because, you know, Santa Claus is everywhere.
Right.
You know, so.
Yeah. You don't want to be, you don't want to be the dad who's like, kids are ruining all the other children's experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Everybody's looking at me like.
Your kid stands up in class, it's like, all you guys are ridiculous. Why do you believe this is true?
Yeah. So you say you do pass out candy on Halloween?
Yeah, we do.
Is there like a gospel track that goes with it?
Right, yeah. I'm just handing kids. It's like a Snickers wrapper, but inside it's a track. It's not even candy. Yeah, no, it's just candy. just candy. Kids are there for candy. It's fun. It's cool. I mean, you get to see. It's like a community experience, right? And I think, especially if you think about suburban America, there's not a lot of community there, right? Like community is not a strong value in suburban America.
My kids always ask me that. So we'll go like look at houses, we'll drive around, and they're like, why is nobody outside? And I was just like,
they're in their backyards.
Because they got big houses and they're
inside.
spread out inside. So.
Right. And so that's one of the reasons I love Halloween, is because it's like one of the few instances where it's like a community experience in these suburban environments. Now, that's not going to be true in every place, right? Like there's certain areas that are far more community based and don't need Halloween, but it's cool to hand out candy and see kids who are from the neighborhood and like get to know your neighbors a little bit better. And it's just in passing, right? But to do that, I think is worth something as Christians, to like know your neighbors and be part of the community.
What's your how do you feel about people who pass out tracts with candy?
I mean, it's cool. Yeah. I'm not gonna tell them not to do it. I'm not a big believer in gospel tracts. Not that they never do anything. Like I think like the Holy Spirit is able to move in ways that we can't even fathom. Right.
Right.
And so he's convicted people of truth and brought him into the family of God through all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
Right. But a gospel tract removes any sort of relationship with who these people are, right? And so I think that you can do it and it can be good, but I'd prefer to invest your energy in evangelism in a way that like has relational capital there as well, as opposed to just words.
Yeah. I think a lot of neighborhoods, communities definitely need to get out and like share the gospel, walking up to people and just starting a conversation. Right. Now, I don't think the bullhorn preaching it's gonna get many people. I think there might be a time and a place for that in a certain setting. Right. But I think when you're just out and you just start up a conversation with somebody, it's more meaningful than, out there with the sign. You're going to hell, repent. It's like, whoa, what you talking about?
Right.
Like, I ain't never even heard this word repent before. What do you mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That type of preaching had like a time, right? I think like during the like first Great Awakening and second Great Awakening in American history, right? Like there were street preachers and evangelists who came out, but the U.S. was a different environment, right? Yeah. Like people in the U.S. tended to have more of a, like they knew the biblical language better than we do now. And so how helpful is, street preaching going to be when you're in an environment where people don't know the words you're saying, right? When they don't know what this means. And so, I think you're right. Like there could be a time and a place. I'm less and less convinced that time and place is now, but so I wouldn't tell people not to do it, but I wouldn't do it myself.
How would you, as a pastor, talk to your congregation about Halloween?
Yeah. I think it would have to be with caution, knowing that people have a lot of assumptions about what Halloween is, right? And that some of these things are good, right? Like, let's be mindful about what we celebrate and why we celebrate it. Let's not glorify things that are wicked. But I would also encourage my church that what we think is wicked sometimes might not actually be wicked, right? Like when we wholesale write off Halloween, and forget that this is, like I said, maybe an instance of rare community in the suburbs. Like you're called that is that wicked, right? Like is community wicked? And when I think about holidays too, like Halloween or even like Thanksgiving and these like harvest holidays, like they come around fall. And back in the day, this was when you like actually harvested food. And so you'd get together and you'd celebrate. And so even when I think of the history, it's like not because people wanted to worship pagan gods. It's because they were celebrating life and they had a pagan framework. And so then they thought to integrate that into these events. But it starts as we're celebrating life, right? Like like Halloween or Thanksgiving or a, winter solstice, like the Christmas stuff, like all of that doesn't start because people are trying to worship pagan gods. Right. It starts because they're living life and they need to have community. They need to celebrate the good things that happen. They need to have space to grieve the bad things that happen. And so it's like they're creating space for these and then just putting their religious framework into that, right? And so I think Halloween starts from a good place. Yeah. And then you get some things that come in culturally that we should not praise, right? That we shouldn't say are good. I think of like the way I think death can be a part of Halloween. And it should be a part of Halloween, but not in a way that glorifies death as if this is like good, or glorifies murder, like what you said about like Michael Myers mask or his knife in this kid's hand and they're covered in blood.
How should it be? Yeah. How should death be in Halloween? What does that look like?
Right. Yeah, so this is one of the things that I like. Another thing, so you have the community aspect, right, which I think is good. But another element of Halloween is that it's one of the rare opportunities for Americans to reflect on death in a holiday, right? Okay. And a lot of other cultures throughout history have had a time where there's some sort of like the dead are passing on, or like the dead are coming back. I
forget what they call it in Mexico. They do. Is it the Day of the Dead?
Yeah, Day of the Dead.
That's what the movie was. That Coco was based
Yeah,
off of?
yeah, right. And so obviously that's coming from like I don't think about the afterlife or dead people in the same way that Coco presents it. Right. Like that's not what I see in scripture as like a biblical framework.
Right. Because they're setting up whole meals and this person's gonna come eat this food. Like, well, scripture tells us not to be talking to dead people, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so in Mexico and a bunch of other cultures, they have times to reflect upon death, right? And it's a community event where they're collectively, and it's like, I think it provides space to almost like what a funeral does, where it's like we're grieving, but also we're gathering together to like support one another. And we're like, I'm not just grieving alone, but I'm now grieving with others. And there's goodness and there can be joy there. There can be appreciation of what I do have, even in the midst of loss, right?
Yeah.
And so like a nationwide holiday that looks at death, I think provides some of the same things. I was reading something a while ago. I forget who it was by, but they were talking about how cultures that talk openly about death and cultures that tend to have moments of celebrating the dead, right? Like the Day of the Dead, or pick any other one, have less anxiety around the potential death, around their potential death, than others do. So if you have a culture where you're celebrating, or not that you're celebrating death, but where you're celebrating, and in that celebration you're remembering the dead, or you're remembering that death is a reality.
So somewhat similar, not the same thing, but similar to how Christians celebrate communion, right?
Yeah, in a sense it could be the same.
The death and resurrection of Jesus. And, yeah.
If you do communion well,
I mean, you got to talk about Jesus dying in communion. So
yeah. I just thought that was fascinating that cultures that celebrate and remember the dead regularly have less anxiety around death.
Yeah.
And growing up in the environment that I grew up in, death was a taboo topic, right? Even when people I know or was connected to died, everybody's going to grieve, right? But it was like a silent grief, if that makes sense. It wasn't a shared grief. And I think some of that comes from the way that we like death is this bad thing. We don't want to think. We're too comfortable in the U.S. At least I'd say my background growing up in the suburbs, right? Like it's incredibly comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're not going to think about death. And when death does come, because it does, no matter how comfortable your life is, you haven't lived a life that's trained on how to process and think through the difficulties of life well.
Yeah.
Because your whole life is built around avoiding the difficulties of life. And then it comes and you're like, don't know what to do about this. And you swallow it and you keep trucking along. And I think it's an unhealthy way to process.
Yeah. I think that,
death. Yeah.
I can't remember the story, who put it out, but it was a story of a guy in China. He was a missionary.
Okay.
And he got put in jail.
Yeah.
And then, he was away from his family. He had a wife here in the States, and I think he had 3 kids. And he went over there. It's illegal in certain parts of China to be a Christian or even have a Bible. And he went over there. He thought it was going to be a short little trip. He wound up being in jail out there for like 7 years. And then he came home, and within that year, he died. And so, how dangerous and how crazy it is over in China, where you're constantly thinking about, if I get caught doing this, I can die, and people have died just by sharing, the gospel. We're here, and we don't think about those things. When we hear it, it's almost like it's not gonna happen here.
Yeah.
Or
right.
Yeah, that will never happen here because we're protected by our Constitution, blah blah blah. So yeah, it's really hard to think through that, like something that's so small and innocent, somebody dying for it.
Yeah.
And we're comfortable, like you said.
Right.
We don't think about those things.
We push it off, pretend like it's not real.
Or we get a flat tire, we lose our minds. We're like, son of a, why?
Right.
What am I gonna do?
It's the small things that become huge.
So yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's good though. No, that's some good
Right.
perspective of thinking through that. I never heard of that though. That's interesting that cultures that talk about death openly
Yeah.
have a lower anxiety rate. It's interesting.
The article was specifically looking at like Latin America.
Yeah. I think I have that
but-
growing up in
yeah.
the environment I grew up in, but it's from
Yeah.
a trauma response.
Yeah, it's gonna be different, and that's why I'm like
because death doesn't scare me or doesn't freak me out.
okay. Yeah.
If I see a dead body, I'm not like, oh my God, it's a dead body. Like I've held
Yeah.
friends, you know, who
Yeah.
have went and passed away. I've seen people get shot and killed. So when I see it, it's not like a thing for me. But my lack of fear of death just is from trauma. It's because I know it's gonna happen eventually. It's not gonna probably happen in that way where like I get shot, but it's gonna happen. We all are on our way to where every day we get a step closer to dying.
Right.
And so I'm not afraid of it, but yeah.
It's not like people should experience more death, right? Like,
Yeah,
that's not gonna,
don't
right?
go out here and just be like, I want to see every dead body that I possibly can. Like, don't do that. But I think
but it's a reality of life.
Yeah, it's a reality. Yeah.
Yeah. And in some environments, you have no choice but to acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
In the suburban environment that I grew up in, you have the choice to pretend like this isn't real until it becomes real. And so I think, develop unhealthy ways of relating to death. And there's a lot of anxiety around my own life and when I'm going to die or the people that I love and them dying. That is not a happy thing, right?
Yeah.
It's not like these should be happy things, but they become almost like unbearable weights for some people.
Yeah.
When this is what humans have been carrying for all of history, right? Like death has been a reality of our existence from the beginning. Like
we hear about a celebrity, at least one celebrity dying every week.
Yeah.
It seems like so.
Yeah, it's all the time.
It's around us everywhere.
Yeah.
So you had said something earlier and I missed it, but I want to talk about these scary movies. So unlike Halloween,
right.
horror movies are around all year round.
Yeah.
Right, every month or every couple months they're putting out a new horror movie. What is your thoughts on horror movies?
So I really love the horror genre personally. I enjoy a good horror movie. And I think the same as Halloween, you got to handle it with care, recognizing that like you can't, sometimes we want to like baptize the whole thing and say, this is good. And just like dunk it in the water and it comes out as like, well, every, war movie is good. And you baptize it, right? And like, I don't want to do that with horror either, right? It's not like they're all good, but I don't think they're all bad either. So it's like, you have to have the boundaries, right? And have the certain understandings of like, well, at a point, this might be unhealthy, right? Especially different people relating to horror in different ways, right?
Yeah.
Like I would never push horror movies on somebody else and be like, hey, I know you tell me that you hate these, but sit next to me and I'm going to force you to watch it. My wife, Hannah, is not a big fan of horror movies. She does not like them at all. And
so
I don't know if we've ever watched a horror movie. Yeah.
Is that a rule?
Right. So when I put them in, she's just not around. That's how it is. Yeah. So like if I'm watching a horror movie, she's just not around.
Okay.
We've watched a few. We live in a house with 3 other roommates, and we've watched a few horror movies, classics, over the past few weeks, and we put them on after Hannah falls asleep. That's been the trend so far. Is she'll fall asleep and then we put a movie on, because I don't want to force her to watch something that she's not going to enjoy to begin with, right? And then on top of that, how it affects her might be different than how it affects me long run, right? Like I was talking to a friend just recently about how when she would watch horror movies growing up, she would watch them, but then she'd have like horrible nightmares afterwards. And it's like the response to it afterwards would be like so full of like anxiety and terror and nightmares, and it's like she doesn't even have control over it. And so it's like, this isn't good for you to watch, right? I've never had that experience. And so I don't want to say it's good for everybody, but also in the same way that Halloween has the potential to be something, right, that allows for community, that allows for us to encounter death in a way that we can like think through things with like safety around it, I think horror can do the same thing. It has the potential to teach us certain things, and it can be helpful in that way. It can also be really unhelpful.
Yeah.
But it could be helpful. Yeah. So
what's some horror movies that you're like,
right?
I'm not gonna watch that one.
Some horror movies that I would not watch. So I'm not like a movie buff or anything like that, and I don't watch a ton of movies.
Right here.
Right, I know, that's what I'm thinking. I was like, I wish Ray could be on this podcast because he's got all the movie knowledge in the world. But there's a number like within maybe like the body horror genre that I've avoided intentionally. Names, I do not remember any of the names. But like the body horror genre starts with like Saw, right? And so it's all about like
movies.
Yeah. And so I've not seen the later Saws. I've seen the original Saw, and it's not. First of all, it's not crazy gory to be. Well, I mean, it's all relative, right? But in terms of how things have progressed and where things are at now, it's not crazy gory. And I also think Saw is trying to make a point. Like it has a message it's communicating, right? Good art is trying to communicate something. And I'm not convinced that all of the body horror that comes out is trying to communicate something. I think sometimes it's just like trying to feed people like this horrible image that you just like can't, like staring at a train wreck, right? Like I just can't take my eyes away. I think sometimes that's what they are, but even Saw like has a point. Yeah, it's communicating something.
Yeah, Saw's really good. I'm okay with the gory movies.
Yeah.
Because I got a weird sense of humor. They're gonna like kill me for this, but they're so predictable, the movies.
100%, yeah.
And so I sit there and I'm like, yeah, this person's gonna die.
100%.
Why would you go in there? I was like, yep,
right.
Stabbed right in the neck, like
right.
So
no, I know. Yeah,
this like exactly it's funny because this is like, you know. And then there's a cultural difference, so it's just like as Black people, we be like, come on, man, like
right.
First of all, I'm not tiptoeing through my house. What was that noise? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, no, not at all.
There's somebody in here. Like, hey, who in here? Who? One of my kids? What's going on? Like, I'm not gonna be tiptoeing through my house.
Right.
We walk really fast. Oh, it sounded like something fell. Oh, it didn't. All right, I'm going back to sleep. But there's all this tiptoeing, and I'd be like, this person's gonna die.
Yeah, you see from a mile away.
Your old 100%. House.
It's just ridiculous sometimes.
And then Chucky.
Yeah.
So the only horror movie that ever scared me was Candyman when I was growing up.
Okay, yeah.
And Candyman was filmed here in Chicago.
Right, yeah.
In the Cabrini Green Projects.
Yeah.
And I had family that lived in there.
Right.
So
it was like, real. Yeah, it became real.
I was like,
you're like, whoa.
4 when that movie came out. So I'm like, I ain't going back over Cuz house because he lived in that building where that dude was.
Right.
And Candyman was just it was scary. And then Chucky was funny because I'm like, fam, this little dog.
What is happening? Yeah.
This little dog, like
it also looks ridiculous.
If y'all don't throw this dog in the garbage on the roof somewhere, and then Michael Myers and like Jason, I'm like, they walking. Like they're not even running. Like they're just walking.
Yeah.
And then you know, I can get Freddy, he's in the dreams. Yeah. But like a lot of these movies, I be just like, it's funny.
Goofy. Yeah.
I'm like, they should put comedy in front of this instead. Comedy horror.
Especially the older ones, you know, like I mean, I've never watched a horror movie from the 80s. Well, I'm in the 80s, right? Like I'm watching horror movies from the 80s in like 2010. And it just is sometimes it's a little goofy. We watched the original Friday the 13th with Jason a couple weeks ago.
Okay.
And it's just goofy. It's so weird. Yeah. Like I had the moment of like, there's been no tension at all. Like I've never once been tense in this movie until like the last few minutes. And then it's like, okay, maybe they're doing something. That movie's not very good to begin with, but
yeah. First of all, he walking at this pace right here. You're running. You're 2 blocks away. How did he catch up?
Right.
So that the movies that I don't watch is the overly demonic movies.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't watch them.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just a conviction that I have.
Yeah.
I used to.
Right.
You know, my older sister, she grew up. She loves horror movies. My wife loves horror movies.
Yeah.
But I don't get jiggy with the over demonic ones. I just be like, you know, it's a little, it's so grievy. You start bringing out, you know, saying spells and crosses. Now I ain't talking about like like Harry Potter, because some people be trying to add Harry Potter in there with like they're doing spells, like they speaking old Latin, like just stop.
Right. Yeah. It's
so I don't
wildly different.
My kids watch Harry Potter. My wife loves Harry Potter.
Yeah.
My wife loves horror movies.
Okay.
I can deal with
respect.
Like I said, the surfy ones, gore or whatever, but the overly demonic one. There was a new one that just came out on Netflix called Deliverance.
Okay.
And they said, I think Oprah was in it. It was a black writer and director. It was his first time ever doing a horror movie. He normally does like comedy, like love comedies.
Okay.
And they said it was a lot of things happening on the set.
Okay.
And so I want to know, like, when you hear stories like this random person got really sick, or this person died, or man, this dude's dog died, and like all these things started to happen on the set, like of these like overly demonic movies. Yeah. What do you feel? What do you think about? What's your perspective on that?
I mean, I've not heard that for Deliverance. I've not seen Deliverance.
I haven't seen it either. I just heard the article.
I don't really like encounter the stories about that sort of stuff often. It does bring to mind like my question for anybody who's like, I don't watch, like I'll watch horror movies, but I won't watch the ones with the demons in it. My first thought is always like, what has like our experience been with the demonic in our life, right? So like, do you have any experience in your, like in the same way that when we talk about death, you're like, okay, yeah, I know what death is, I've experienced in my life. Like, what does experiencing the demonic look like in your life? Like, do you have any stories about, not to like flip it, not to try to flip it on you, but that's my first question always.
Two very clear, vivid experiences with demons. Mm-hmm. And so they didn't come from me watching a movie.
Okay.
It was at this lady's house, and she was like demon possessed. I was going person got the call.
Okay.
And man, we need to go over here really quick. We're just gonna pray. And I was like, all right, cool. We're gonna go pray. And then walked in there, and it was like a whole thing. And this was I grown up in church. You hear about demons. You hear about people saying casting out demons, but you just see them pray, and you don't hear anything or see anything.
Yeah.
But this one was like, you feel the presence in the room. She starts shaking. It was a whole thing. That there was a demonic presence in the home. So that was my first one. It's a long story, so I won't bore you with the details. We'll talk about it later. But yeah, it was a crazy experience.
Okay.
And I was a new believer. This was 2012. And so this lady had, she was trying to come out of this crazy lifestyle that she was in. She was demon possessed. Yeah. And so that's one. And then seeing a kid being possessed by a demon.
Okay.
So that's
right.
The two
like you but the thing is like you've had experiences with it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's for me how I want to think about it, because I believe the demonic is real, right? And in the same way, I think we have to be careful, right? Because murder and death are also real and tragic. And so you don't want to make light of them when you go watch, Friday the 13th.
Yeah.
Or, Halloween, right? And yet still those movies, I believe, serve some purpose, right? In the same way, I'd say the demonic is real and you don't want to make light of it, but still movies about the demonic might serve some purpose, right? So in the same way that, evil and sin exists, the demonic exists. And I grew up in an environment where, like, in the type of church background that wasn't very like charismatic. And so the demonic was always like, you can't really cast out demons, and it was very like doubtful of the, there was always this tension of like, yeah, demons are real. Like the demonic powers are real. They're out there. You got to be careful of it. But nobody was ever like, oh yeah, I went and I prayed for somebody to have a demon cast out. Right. It was much more like, well, we went and like we got them connected to a therapist, or like we put them on medication, or they had to go to the doctor, or like they're just crazy or whatever. Right. So like actually giving power to the demonic was not something that I grew up seeing in churches. And, Yet those same churches who refuse to acknowledge demonic, when I think reflecting back, it's like these things are here in these communities, like they're real. And sometimes people are just blinded to them, right? Christians are just blinded to them because they're not being taught how to discern well.
Well,
right?
I mean, Ephesians 6 is really clear, right? Like, what are we wrestling against? Why does God tell us to put on the full armor of God and we keep it on? And so when people say, you know, they have their takes on like, is casting out demons real? But it's like, well, what are we praying if God tells us to pray, right? It's communication with God and stuff like that. Like, well, what are we doing it for if demons don't exist or if they have no effect, you know, today or on this side of eternity? What are we praying for?
Yeah.
Like, what are we wrestling against? Like, you know, and so is the devil just like one dude and he's attacking people like one at a time, or is he like what's going on? So yeah, I wrestled with that for a long time because I grew up in the churches that I was part of as a kid. They were overly charismatic, and then when I became a believer, there was somewhat of a balance, but it was still a little bit more charismatic. And then I was exposed to like John Piper and John MacArthur, and then I was like, wait a second. And then I read this book, Strange Fire, and I was I'm a Calvinist now. So for about 8 months, I was like a 5-point Calvinist.
Right.
I was like, casting out demons and all that stuff is not real. I was just like,
which is very
hallucinating and all this other stuff. And then I had to, you know, experiencing things again and having these conversations. I was like, nah, it was real. Like, my mom has always had this crazy experience with, I know we kind of going off of the movies. We'll get back to that in a second. But she's always had this crazy connection with her kids. And it was always the God revealing things to her through dreams or visions.
Okay. Yeah.
Where's she getting these visions and these dreams from? Because this stuff will come true, right? The Bible says to test the spirits, right? And so one time, I got locked up. It was a small petty crime. My mom, nobody knew. Like when I used to do dirt when I was a young adult, I did it by myself. Okay. Nobody could go off and tell what I did. I was always by myself or with people who didn't know my family. And she knew. She knew what I had on. She knew the time that it happened. She knew where it happened. And I was just like, there's no way that this lady could have known. Yeah. And then I started thinking back to my childhood and all the experiences and encounters of her, things that I've seen and heard I couldn't understand because I was small. But now as an adult, I'm like, God was like revealing things to her. And then you read about some of these things in scripture, and I was just like, those were real. Yeah. Like, my mom knew I wasn't living at home. So it wasn't like I got dressed and she seen what I had on. I was not at home. I was in the street. She didn't know. And she knew. And she came and she said, how was it? And I was like, how was what? And then she was like, I know what happened. She started giving me all these details. And I was just like, that's crazy. Yeah. And I asked her, the Lord showed me. And I was just like, well, what?
Right.
So
what that can't happen.
What supposed to be like, nah, ma, you lying. You ain't nobody's.
I just read this book and it says you're lying.
Yeah, I just read this book and you're lying. So
you
have those type of experiences, and it's just like
this is real.
This is real.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's another thought that I have really quick. I believe that when Satan landed, I believe that he landed in India.
Okay.
Here's why.
Yeah.
Their experience with the demonic, or even with the power of God, with the healings and things like that, is so strong and in a way that we've never seen it before. For one, Christians here, like we talked about earlier, we're so dependent on our money, our medicine, our technology.
Right. Yeah.
We don't give God a lot of room to step in and do the miraculous. Because we're so like, my head hurt, instead of just praying like, God, would you take this headache away? I believe that you can heal me. I don't need no medicine. We're like, where's the Tylenol? I'm gonna go buy this $10 bottle of Excedrin. We start to our faith is very small. It's not until we get to the big things like, Lord, please heal me of this cancer. And it was like 4 days before something crazy has happened and we're praying and really seeking the Lord. But even in the small things, we have like no faith. We put our faith in medicine, technology. And the people that I've talked to that travel there or live there or they're from there, the stories that they have shared with me are like crazy.
Yeah.
And then all the different gods and all that other stuff. But that's a whole nother podcast. But yeah, I believe that back to the movies.
Yeah.
For me, it's not necessarily a fear. Not many things scare me, but it makes me feel a certain way when I watch like the overly demonic movies.
Right.
And so that's why I don't watch them.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah.
Which I totally understand. And so the reason that I do watch, like, so one of my favorite horror movies is The Conjuring, which is like
I've seen
literally about fighting demons.
Yeah.
Right. But if you watch that movie, it's one of the most like Christian horror movies you could watch in terms of what it's communicating. Because there's this whole idea of like evil oppression happening, and they literally are defeating it with Jesus. Like it's these people who are faithful parts of the church being sent to go, exercise it's literally Jesus conquering the evil spirits. And so, I mean, that's just The Conjuring. Yeah. But my thought is like, if we can watch a horror movie about death, knowing death is real and how destructive death is, why can't we not watch a horror movie about demonic, knowing the demonic is real and how destructive the demonic is, right? It's not that these things aren't real and we should engage flippantly with them, but I don't want to give undue power to the demonic by saying that if I watch this, I'm not going to be affected in a way that if I go watch something about death or sin or evil or wickedness, that's also not going to affect me. It's like these things in my mind all operate the same, right? So I engage wisely, right? If I'm like I need to be aware of how something is hitting me. You like any type of media or entertainment, whether it's music or movies or TV shows or books, like I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's, romance or horror or comedy. It's like, how is this connecting with me and what is it doing within me? Yeah. And it can do all of those things, can do negative things within me.
Yep.
Game
of Thrones.
Right.
Like I didn't watch it
incredibly
for a
negative
long time
things.
because I didn't even see it, but I heard about all the crazy sex scenes, and I was just like, I ain't trying to.
Yeah.
I'm like, I want to watch it because it's about dragons and war. So
right.
I'm like, oh my goodness.
Like, it sounds my wife like so much fun.
She was like, you would enjoy it. It's a really good story, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And I was just like, okay. And then finally, we're watching it, but my finger's always on the trigger, like fast forward.
Yeah.
Which sucks because some of those scenes, like the dialogue is really important, and then but you gotta.
Yeah, but there's naked people.
Naked people in the scene. So yeah, those I don't know if any Christian can honestly say like, yeah, I'm okay with. I could watch a little sex scene and it doesn't affect me. Yeah, I don't know. I would say that you're lying, but
right.
I'm not
like right. In the back of my mind, I'd be thinking cap. Right? There's no way.
Straight up, like
right. Like there's no way. Right.
Yeah. So I don't think we should be watching any type of sex scenes. It's soft porn at that point. But yeah. Right. So.
But then there is also, I mean, it's very different from sex scenes, right? But art for the longest time include nudity, right? Now it's not sexualized, so it's very different. But like that's a normal thing throughout a lot of, at least, like European painting movements, right? And it's not sexualized. And so even then it's like, it's not the naked body that's wrong. It's what we're doing with it, right? In the same way that I'd say it's not the portrayal of the demonic that's wrong, but it's what you're doing with it.
Yeah.
Right. In the same way that it's like, it's not murder. It's not like death that's wrong, right? Death is just it's an issue that we face, right? But it's like, what are you saying about that? So it's like, what are you saying about all these things?
The Bible says it's a time for all this. There's going to be a time that we potentially might have to kill someone, and it's like, oh snap, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So what do you do? What's your mindset behind it? So intent matters.
Yeah, right. And that's the thing. It's like it's the intent that I find so interesting. Yeah. Especially in horror movies, because the more that I think about them, they're communicating things that I'm like, this is an important thing to communicate. Mm-hmm. Like it's important to communicate these ideas in horror about. Horror is one of the few genres that still has like a pretty clear like good beats evil mentality. Not all horror, but like specifically the demonic horror, like the Conjuring stuff, and that whole universe that they've created, right? Like the good defeats the evil, and sometimes not wholly, right? Sometimes it takes a few movies to do this, right? But it is like it's who's good and who's evil.
Yeah. And
like a lot of, not that it's wrong to have nuance, right, in other media, but you'll be like, oh, well, they're like an anti-villain, right? They're like the good guy, but they're kind of bad because they like beat people up, right? Or they kill people. And it's like, whoa, but they're the good guy. And so like horror is one of the few genres where it's like, this is good and this is bad and the good's gonna win out.
With Batman.
Right.
It's like, Batman, you're the most violent son of a person I've ever seen. Like,
right. Like you clearly have some stuff going on.
Just break that dude's arm like that. Just lock him up.
Right.
Yeah. No, that's good. What would you say to a person who horror movies like trigger them as far as them being scared, right? And this is what the Bible says about
like fear.
Being fearful. Yeah.
I don't think that being afraid in a movie is the same thing as fear when scripture says like, do not fear. I don't think they're the same concept at all. I think that every person is going to respond differently, and that if you're afraid in the moment because the tension is high, that's very different from leaving the horror movie and then being afraid that, or then like building your whole life around the fear that this is real or this is going to happen to me, right? So if you think about the like slasher films, and what you end up doing is like not letting your kids go outside because there's murderers out there, and they're gonna, or like, you know, you watch whatever sort of cop show and it's like people are out here kidnapping kids, and so I'm not gonna let my kids go outside because they're gonna get kidnapped, right? Like I think that's more the fear. It's not to be unwise, but it's to say like engage in the world. Like you can't pull yourself out of the world.
Right.
You have to be. You're like, we are saved into this world, right? Like we're not saved and then just removed. It's not like you get just taken up to heaven right away. It's like, no, Christ comes and he transforms you and he leaves you here. And so like, what are we doing here? Right? And I don't think that the response is, well, what I'm doing here is trying to get away. Right? Because if that was really my goal, there's other things that could have happened, right?
Be in the world, but not of the world.
Right. Like, and so I think that's more the type of fear that is being talked about, like when it says, do not be afraid. I think it's similar. And there's like a conversation about like what anxiety means, but like when Jesus talks about like be anxious for nothing, right? Now it's not, I don't want to make it seem like to have anxiety is sinful, but I think that's a similar concept, right? Of like, when you think about your future, are you ruled by fear? Which ultimately for me is communicating you have no hope. That's what it is, right? Like fear illustrates like a lack of hope. And so when I'm watching a horror movie and I'm afraid of what's happening, it's not because I'm hopeless. I'm not a hopeless person watching a horror movie and, oh, the tension's really high. What's going to happen to that person? Because the kind of hope that I have doesn't really matter what happens to this fictional character, you know? Yeah. So that's the difference. Yeah.
I'm getting certain looks as of lately because they're like, what show are you watching with your family? And I was just like, The Walking Dead.
Yep. So, nice family friendly show, you know?
So obviously we don't let them see certain parts. Me and my wife, we kind of preview it. And so we know what's going to be what.
Right.
But have you ever had any pushback from like your community or your church as far as your takes on Halloween or horror movies?
A little bit for sure. I mean, like I said, so like my wife feels totally different. I don't think that she'd say like horror movies are objectively bad all the time, but she's like, I don't want to watch horror movies ever. Like if they've disappeared, I wouldn't care. And so when I talk about like the benefits of watching them, because it communicates something about whatever area of the human experience it's talking about, I don't think that she's a little harder to convince that that's true, you know? Not that she's saying, oh, we'll never watch them, but for her, right? So there's that like little bit of pushback. But I'm also within churches being pastored by folks who were raised in the, like, they call it like the satanic panic of like the 80s, you know? And that was when it was like, you can't, that was what came to the point of like, you can't watch, what's it called? Harry Potter.
That's when The Exorcist came out in the 80s.
Right. Yeah. And so I get to be part of churches and serve under pastors who have different opinions than I have. And my job is not to, like, I want to submit to them in that. And so within the church as a whole, I'm not trying to create disunity
right.
by saying, hey, I know our pastor said you should be careful about watching horror movies, and I'm saying go watch everything you want, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not trying to do that.
Right.
And so a topic like this is one where it's like with friends, in our community group, we talk about this stuff and it comes out, and that's an environment where it's like I get to know the people and the people know me. And so like one of the most important things is like I want people to know that when I say something that's a weird perspective, right, to use like that that fundamentally I care first and foremost about the church and the well-being of the church, and like forget about what I believe.
Yeah.
Like I care about this. And then if everybody knows that I care about this deeply and that I'm working towards preserving unity, showing the beauty here, like saying like, no, my pastor is someone I respect and I want you to see he's a respectable person, right? Like these things, if you know that, then I can start saying, and I kind of disagree about that thing, or I kind of disagree about this thing. But first, it's like I have to show that I believe in unity first and foremost. Otherwise, you come out and you start talking about all these things you believe, and it's just going to create disruption.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's helpful.
No.
Especially in topics like this where it's not essential.
No.
If someone says, I'm never watching a horror movie and never said Halloween, it's like, that's the least of my worries in your life. Like there's a million other things going on that are probably more important for you to think about than that. And so cool. Don't watch horror movies and don't, mess around with Halloween. That's fine. I disagree, but that's fine.
What you just said was beautiful. But I want to give you the last word in the best pastoral way.
Yeah.
Summarize these and close us out with your thoughts and as far as giving some people some encouragement when it comes to Halloween.
Okay, what I would say is this. Here's how I'd close out. In all forms of entertainment, media, in all forms of secular community that exists outside the church, there's sin and brokenness and danger that Christians have to be aware of, right? You got to be careful about affirming everything that happens in the world. And yet also within all those spaces, something is there that is worth engaging with. And so in horror movies, I think there's a potential for there to be a good thing that can benefit you. In Halloween, there's community. In Halloween, there might be the potential of talking about death in a holistic way, right? And so like my encouragement would be don't write off everything within the world without recognizing that your mission is for the world, right? And so you engage holistically with it, saying, here's what's good. You did all that wrong, but here's what's good, and here's why that's good. And that can point back to Jesus, right? If you look at movies and you start talking about here's why I think, Scream is a great movie and what it's communicating, and you start talking about that, all of a sudden people are going to think about the message that is rooted, that you believe as a Christian is true, instead of thinking about, the death and the murder and the fear and the horror, right? Because those things are just a means towards communicating. Yeah. So be mindful of that. Our mission is for the world, right?
Yes, it is.
That's what we're about.
Yep. Go into all the world. Make disciples. Man, this was fun. We
was
talking about that. I started thinking about the Passion of the Christ. Man, would that be considered a horror movie?
Right, yeah. No, there's all sorts of Christian horror out there.
Yeah,
too,
that was a pretty, it was a lot of gore.
Right.
People, he was getting whipped and there was blood everywhere. It was a lot. So,
yeah, that's a brutal movie.
But man, this was fun, Ethan. I appreciate you coming on here,
fun.
Man. And I'll do this again.
Definitely.
One day. I got a whole list of things that I'm going to let you be like, I want to talk about that. Then you just come on here and we'll talk about it. But yeah, my name is Darry. This is Ethan. Until the next one, we out of here. Ray, you should have been here. Shame on you. Peace.